right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Christian's Colloquy. I'm Christian. I'm so glad that you could join us today. As you can see here, I'm not alone. I have my friend Connor on. Connor, welcome. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm fantastic. It's great to have you on. We've known each other for a few years now, I believe, but I think this is the first time we're having a conversation like this for the public to see. So people are going to see what sort of happens when a couple of theology guys online now have a conversation. The world's getting another inside look. So looking forward to it. And as the title, people are reading it and know what's going on with the series. Different Christian denominations, traditions are on. You're here going to tell us about Lutheranism, which is exciting. I think a lot of people from my circles, Evangelical Baptist, Lutheranism might be a bit of a mystery. And is it just Roman Catholicism, but Protestant, or is it super Protestant and German Protestantism? A lot of maybe misconceptions or misunderstandings, but we'll get those cleared up. We'll hear about the history, what it's like in the churches. But before we dive in, I want to give you a chance, let people know who you are, what you're about, and what you're doing.
Sure. So, my name's Connor Longaphie. I come from Southern Ontario. Right now, I'm living just 30 minutes south of Owen Sound. Not to dox myself, but I did my undergraduate at the rival school of Christians Baptist Seminary. I went to Toronto Baptist Seminary. I'm actually wearing the logo of my school colors so that we could have one of our rival soccer matches in this Zoom.
Yeah.
And then I did my pastoral ministry certificate at the Institute of Lutheran Theology. That's about a year certificate. And I'm finishing up my MDiv work now at Luther House of Study, which is a part of Sioux Falls Seminary in South Dakota. I do that online. Nice. And I'm studying there under Dr. Stephen Paulson and Dr. Chris Krogan and Dr. Sarah Stenson. To any Lutherans who may be, or anybody who knows Lutheranism, Dr. Paulson is a big name. And so some alarms might go off in their heads, and they may know exactly what kind of Lutheranist I am now. But right. I also run the Canadian Lutheran Gospel Network. And that is a conglomerate multimedia network of the Canadian Association of Lutheran Congregations, which is the synod that I'm a part of. I'm a part of two synods. The second is an American counterpart called the Lutheran Congregations in Mission for Christ. And if you go to the Canadian Lutheran Gospel Network, you'll find lots of different things. You'll find a sermon feed of all of our pastors' sermons, a Bible study feed of all of our recorded Bible studies from all of the different pastors. You will find a confession study of the Book of Concord, kind of like a catechesis class. You will find an apologetics thing, a study of Lutheran books. You will find a history and church history and historical theology podcast that I mainly work on with another man called Pastor Roland, who's a pastor out in Medicine Hat, Alberta, and that's called Blood and Bone. And we do most of our work there, me and Pastor Roland. And we also have a flagship podcast where we put the big episodes that are done with the Synod President. I also have a personal podcast where I put up all of my sermons, all of my Bible studies, and everything that I do and work on, which is called Transcendent Truth. That's been my brand for some years now, back since first year of my undergraduate. So if anybody's interested in any of the work I'm doing there, they can go to those websites. Any other information about me: I'm a father, I'm a husband, and I'm in my last week of my vicarage, which some people might know to be an internship or a super internship. Right. And so I've received my first call, and in a few weeks I will be an ordained pastor. So that's all about me. Yeah. Also, my favorite color is orange.
Oh, thank you very much. And what a timely color. Good. Glad to hear that. So wow, you got a lot going on. So people, if you're interested, maybe this interview will be a bit of a teaser or a trailer or something along those lines. If anything Connor mentioned sound interesting or fascinating, especially if you want to learn more about Lutheranism and get into the church history, that side of things, links will be in the description. I'll get at least a few of those. You can check out his writing, the podcast, and everything there. So, and as Connor mentioned, yes, we have a bit of a rivalry between our two seminaries. TBS and Heritage have, I think, a friendly rivalry. There's, I think it's a lot of brotherhood there, but that's fantastic to hear. And that's one of the things. Sad to see Connor not in the Baptist world anymore, but I think that's what makes this interview super helpful for my largely Baptist audience. Connor knows the language, similar circles here. So I think we'll have a lot of good things to discuss, and hopefully things where I think people already got a sneak preview with Lutheranism, understanding the landscape. There's a lot of synods and acronyms and different things like that, but you know what we're about and what we're familiar with. So I think you'll do a great job explaining. So that's a lot, but let's dive in with a few of these questions that we have about other Christian traditions, denominations, and I think Lutheranism, there's a lot of history that people might be familiar with in a general sense. I think when it comes to most other Protestant traditions, let's just keep it there for a moment. People typically know the story when it comes to Luther and Lutheranism, at least those early years, since we all look back to that as maybe our starting point in a certain sense, or the place that we really latch onto with our history. So why don't you just back us up a bit to Lutheranism, and maybe, I don't know how you want to take this, if you want to go pre-Luther into Luther, or what came after Luther. I know for Lutherans that it's a lot of what came after the figure of Martin Luther that they'll look to with confessional documents and history and movement. So feel free, Connor, take us wherever we need to go and let us
Okay.
know about the origins of Lutheranism.
Yeah, so particularly I want to go before Luther, and
Mm,
there's a particular reason why. And we'll get to why that is in just a bit. But yeah, it's true. In a sense, when we're looking at Lutheran history, no matter whether we're Lutheran, Baptist, some kind of evangelical or Presbyterian, we all look at Luther as part of our history as Protestants. And in a way, I really want to stress the before Luther, in part, not entirely, but in part, because the before Luther and the Luther himself is all of our histories.
mm,
And it's really important to know that. Less important to know about the Lutheran confessions. And we'll get into why, even for Lutherans.
mm,
But so before we have Luther, we have the medieval German and European context, right? And as some of you might know from just your Protestant history, there was something that the Roman Church was doing called indulgences.
mm,
As well as this, there were many different kinds of greed, mismanagement, spiritual abuses in the Roman Catholic institution at the time. But one of the chief insults that Luther was getting most mad about were indulgences, where Rome was sending people in. So they'd have a building project. This was what was happening at the time. They had a very large building project. I won't mention which one. You can go look it up. And so they needed to fund for it. And so they said, you know what would be a fun idea? How about we tell people that they're all of their grannies and their uncles are in hell or purgatory. And so we'll go, and how about we tell them to pay some money to get their grannies and their uncles out of purgatory. When a coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs, they would
mm,
say. And this offended Luther. It offended many, many people. But this wasn't the only abuse, right? There was also great immorality in the clergy and religious orders, the monks, the nuns, etc. There was a lot of uneducated priests, not even to mention the uneducation that was going around in the laity. And there was useless, I say useless with an emphasis on useless, scholasticism. We have the joke of people talking about how many angels can dance on the point of a needle. These are things that were being discussed. What
mm.
was not being discussed was the care of souls and of sinners and how to save them, because that wasn't really part of the scheme. If you want to talk about saving sinners, then you're going to talk about the building project and getting them to give you some money. So you
Right.
can see the huge problems that would arise from this, right? And at the same time, this was a perfect soil for revolution and reform, especially because printing of books was becoming a thing very
Mm,
soon. And so when Luther comes on the scene, we have this guy, right? He's not only a scholarly man, but he's an Augustinian monk. He takes his faith very, very seriously. He takes theology very, very seriously. He's very rooted in the fathers. He's very rooted in the scriptures. He was an Old Testament professor, particularly.
mm,
And a lot of people label him with OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. And what this means is that he was focusing upon the wrath of God. And he was constantly going back to the point of saying, how can God love me if I'm such a sinner? And he would go back to confession and back to confession, and it would not soothe his soul. Because especially back in that time, you'd go to confession, and what would you hear? Now do penance,
mm,
right? Well, what if I didn't do the penance right? Or have perfect contrition? What if I didn't do the contrition properly? right? So what Luther was looking for was a salvation that was given freely as gift from God himself, not one that he had to do or one that he had to partake in or contribute to. He needed comfort. And this is one of the very unique things about Lutheranism, is that in many different groups of Protestantism, we can go back and say this is a founding figure, even one single founding figure, which is usually not correct, but
Right.
we can go back to at least one, maybe a few. With Luther, this founding figure's motivation wasn't even a rigor for academia or even a passion for truth. It was a need for the comfort of his soul, right? So who better to go and feed the sheep than a hungry sheep? Right? So
Right.
that's kind of the movement that you're looking at. And that really is what shaped Lutheranism going forward. And it did give it some unique contours and characteristics. Now, moving forward then in Luther's experience, he was teaching some lectures through Paul mostly. But so he started in the Psalms, he worked through Romans, he worked through Galatians, Ephesians. These were some of the books that drew him to what we now call the Protestant gospel, especially Romans 1 verse 17, right? So if you go and you pick up his, even it's a pre-Reformation, it's pre-1517. I believe it's a 1515. I have it right here. This one.
Nice.
If
Yep.
you can go and pick up this, it's backwards because of the camera, but at least in the way I see it in the camera. But so if you go and read that, you'll see that that spark of the Reformation is there. Now, it wasn't quite there. And so we say when he gets to 1517, he nails the 95 Theses on the door. That's mainly about the abuses and the indulgences. Most Roman Catholics now would agree with the 95 Theses. Most Protestants would not. And so the 95 Theses are not a Protestant document. They're not a Lutheran document. And it's between 1517 and 1521, which is the Diet of Worms, where he does all the things, here I stand, blah, 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 can't do anything else, blah, 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 burn the books, no thanks, that stuff, right? Between 1517 and that's when Lutheranism really becomes Lutheranism, the way that we understand it. The Evangelisch, or however they say it, it becomes that. It becomes the gospel faith. And so he's writing books. He's writing, for example, the Heidelberg Disputation. He's writing Babylonian Captivity of the Church. He's writing on the freedom of a Christian. He's writing all of these really, really solid gospel books. He's writing commentaries. And so these are the books that form Lutheranism. And they're publishing like wildfire. They're getting into the hands of the laity. Everyone's reading this. And so everybody's invested in this. And you have this movement of people who've been convinced, radically changed in their minds and their hearts and their hands by the gospel, which was written and preached in this time from between 1517 to 1521. And so it's not so much, and this is what is emphasized by the guys you mentioned earlier, that it's not so much a Luther movement, as much as Luther said some things, a bunch of people became affected by it, and then they pushed him and strengthened him to go forward with what no man could ever have done by themselves. So this is a preaching movement, but it's a Holy Spirit movement, and it's a congregational movement. And we want to hold those three things in tandem, that it's not Luther coming out and speaking truth where there was none, but it's Luther in spite of himself. The Holy Spirit is speaking truth through him, and all the people are holding him to it and saying, you stick with that. Don't you dare deny that now, that you've gone and you've given us free forgiveness, right? And we can debate, and it is debated, whether the Heidelberg Disputation 1518 is when Luther got it. Some say yes, some say no. But the important thing is, by the time of 1521, the Diet of Worms, he had it, and he was preaching it and teaching it, and everyone was accepting it and receiving it in faith. That's the important thing. And just before we move on from Luther, it does need to be mentioned, of course, that Luther was not a Calvinist. Just so we have that clear. And this mistake comes from people who only read The Bondage of the Will, and then they say, well, that's Calvinism. Most Lutherans might even say the same thing, right? And the important thing to remember is when the Lutherans did confess the doctrine of election, which is Article 11 in the Formula of Concord, we did not agree with the bondage of the will. So just keep that in mind. Not everything Luther wrote is in the confessional documents not all Lutherans agree with Luther on everything. Some Lutherans agree with Luther over and against the Book of Concord. That's also something to keep in your minds. And so yeah, moving forward, then that affected lots of churches. Melanchthon came along, a second-hand man, wrote about half of the Book of Concord.
Right.
And then you have the Lutheran divines, etc., the confessional writers. But what's really important is that early bit from 1517 to 1521, because that not only influenced the Lutheran Church, that influenced all of Protestantism. So
yeah, no, that's fantastic, Connor. And I have to first say I have a few comments, but wow, you're an amazing storyteller. People check out his podcast and his stuff. That if you're into church history, just the way he's describing it right now, this is why so many of us are into church history. It is fascinating. It has so much color and depth. Check it out. Listen to Connor. I'm sure he's got a lot more material like this. But on what you just said now, I think I have three things I want to maybe comment on, and then a question after that to get a bit deeper. So first thing I think we have to note here from what Connor is saying at the start, where people think about the Reformation, they think about that history, they think academic ivory towers, books being flung at each other, and that is a part of the story. There were the theologians and the doctors and the professors debating, and of course this isn't a hard distinction, but I think what people really needed to hear right now is that this was a pastoral movement. It sounds like there was a genuine concern. But before we get to how we spell out the theology, people could just look at the landscape of the church during those times and say, something's wrong here. We know what the Bible says. We know who Jesus was, and we're looking at the church, and there's a mismatch here. There's the immorality, there's the indulgence situation. I think it's easy. It becomes a word now, but I think people, if you were to think about that, how distressing that would be for souls thinking, oh my goodness, my dear aunt is trapped away in purgatory, and the only way to get her out is if I offer up my money that I hard earned during this hard time, and thinking like that. So, and people know this, my family is German. So these are stories that we sometimes hear, and I think it's easy to forget maybe in North America and other places, but how hard the times were during the Reformation, and of course the wars that followed, that these were real people in those situations hearing this theology. This wasn't in their history textbooks. And of course, you have the pastors back then who are like Luther, just a totally trained and Augustinian monk person who knows his stuff, but he's feeling this himself, where for him it was a very real issue. So that's just me encouraging people. Think about how this would have been felt at the time. It wasn't just a textbook for them, something going on far away. This was real people in real situations with real needs. And that's why I think Luther's story is so amazing. Check out a biography of him, fascinating figure, just a lot of deep thought there. The second thing that I wanted to say, and I think, Connor, you brought this out so fantastically well, is that there's, I guess, development on Luther's part where people typically think 1517, that is Protestantism, that story with the nailing of the theses on the door, that's a Protestant document. I've seen Protestant I guess merchandise sellers, or whatever they're called, clothing, apparel, they'll sell posters of the 95 Theses as something Protestants, marketed to Protestants, can put on their wall. And I get it, I appreciate it. That's sort of like the moment we associate with Reformation. But yeah, reading through those lists, you get the impression, yeah, Luther is a guy in the Roman Church believing the things, and he's wanting to have a discussion within that context, where I think people need to recognize, as you pointed out, from 1517, 1521, there is a lot of thought going on. And people, I think we need to get beyond the narrative of thesis and then Protestant church. We need to realize there was a development. And the third thing is that Luther gets a lot of attention, and I think with good reason. I think it might have been R.C. Sproul who said the story of the Reformation is Luther and some other guys, where it's Luther is a dominating figure there. But I think we need to recognize, as you were saying, if it were just Luther, it would be a totally different story, where it really is a story of the Holy Spirit's work and in a group of people. I like that you mentioned congregational, and of course, as a Baptist, I love that word, but there is a sense in that this was a movement of God's people, and we need to recognize, and I think this is why you and I find church history so fascinating. There are stories there are people there that we forget about, and when you discover them, you find so much encouragement and so much just more information, but also you get the witness that, hey, the Holy Spirit is working in a lot of people. It wasn't just one guy and he tricked everyone, or he had such a charisma, everyone chose to follow him. there's a lot more going on there. And I don't think it can be explained without a doctrine of the Holy Spirit, of a person working in history. So, Connor, fascinating history. People, check out more of this. We're going to dive back in, but maybe one question. I don't know if this is something we wanted to talk about later, but you mentioned it a couple times now, the Book of Concord, that appears to be a big deal in Lutheranism. You mentioned how Luther might not be totally reflected in there. I'll just mention, I have the Bondage of the Will right here. I grabbed it, but this is definitely where I could say, and people know that I would consider myself a Calvinistic Baptist, where this is the only actual primary resource of Luther that I have as a hard copy, yeah, as a actual physical book. And this was a gift, actually. So it wasn't on purpose, but there definitely is a story of how do Lutherans relate to Luther, but also how do the broader Protestant families sort of appropriate him, view him, where I think it becomes easy to think, oh, Luther said that, and it sounds like he's a Calvinist here. Therefore, Lutherans, what are you doing? You're missing what your guy had to say. But as you mentioned, there's a lot more than just Luther, and it seems like this Book of Concord, that's where a Lutheran would go and say, hey, no, that is the final product, or that's the canonical authority, of confessional authority, of course, in a sola scriptura Protestant sense. So maybe just talking about that a little bit. What is the Book of Concord?
Sure. So the Book of Concord, it's a very, very, how would I put it, complicated relationship with Lutheranism itself. But when we just look at the Book of Concord isolated, and it's hard to do that apart from its history, apart from its acceptance in both historic and contemporary eras. But if we just look at what it is the Catechism, small and large. It is the Augsburg Confession of Faith. It is the Apology, the defense of the Augsburg Confession. It's the treatise on the power and the primacy of the Pope. It's the small called articles. It's the formula of Concord, both larger and smaller forms, epitome and solid declaration. Now, this is what's called a confession of faith. Now, the difficult part is realizing this didn't all come, first of all, we have to realize this didn't all come at once. Just like that movement from 1517 to 1521, we have a movement in the Book of Concord itself. So we have the early documents like the small small catechism and the Augsburg Confession. And then later we have a building. And it's been described by some naysayers as a long run-on email thread of angry people. But it's one-sided too. That's the worst part, is that you don't even see what they're angry about per se.
Nice.
And that is kind of a fair description of how it reads. It doesn't read the way you would read a different kind of a confession, as you put it in the Reformed Church, right? Westminster Confession, or Belgic Confession, or Savoy Declaration, or the 1689. It does not read like that. It does not read systematically at all. And so that's important to remember. When we look at, for example, the Augsburg Confession, this was not a group of men sitting down to say, let's put out a systematic declaration of the faith, but they were responding to, in every single one of these documents, a specific need at a specific time, with specific language that had been developed at a specific point. And so you'll even notice there's differences between the Apology of the Augsburg Confession and the Formula of Concord. And before any of the conservative Missouri senators get mad at me, and I'm sure we'll talk about them later, but that's acknowledged in the Formula of Concord. It says that for example, the language of sanctification has been described in this way in the 90 or up until this point in the Book of Concord, but now we're going to use it this way. So there's development even through the confessions themselves. And it's also important to realize that upon the Book of Concord, certain synods, for example, back then, as you probably know, being of German heritage, Germany wasn't Germany, right? It was a bunch of different areas. And so one area was Saxony, and we have a document called the Saxon Visitation Articles. And this was actually also confessed by the church in Saxony. And so you have, even within the churches that confess the whole Book of Concord, even documents beyond that. Now, outside of Germany, it's a different story. For the most part, in Scandinavia and in the Baltic regions, they were confessing the Augsburg Confession and the Small Catechism, and then they just went with that, because then they said, because all of these things are circumstantial, all of these things are situational, these documents have nothing, like they don't reflect our problems. They're just German problems, or they're
Mm,
just Saxon problems. We don't have these problems, so why would we adopt this confession of faith? And so that's one of the very different functions between the Lutheran confessions and the Reformed confessions, is that they're not systematic in any way, shape, or form, but they're totally situational, totally circumstantial. Now, when we break it down a little bit more, though, we're going to start with the Augsburg Confession. And this is the presentation of the evangelical, as they would call it. That's not meaning in the sense that you would be an evangelical Baptist, but it specifically means Lutheran
right.
in this sense, and Catholic faith, because they were also defending that. And
Mm,
it's also a repudiation of what they saw as Roman abuses, and it's written as an ecumenical dialogue, or it was a dialogue. So it was presented to the Roman Catholics to plead our case and say, look, we are part of the Catholic Church. We are Catholic Christians, true to the historic faith. This is not a new thing. We didn't invent anything. And so it's written as an ecumenical dialogue, not purely a polemic, not really even a systematic document. And the apology, or the defense of that same confession, is an explanation. You could think of it as a commentary, and this arose when the Roman Catholics said, "We don't like your confession of faith. Here are some problems with it." So we said, "Here, okay, let's unfold it some more, explain to you what we really mean." Now, the treatise on the power and the primacy of the Pope was written as a supplement to that same confession. Um, the Small Catechism is the way that that confession of faith is to be taught in the Lutheran churches. The Large Catechism is 10 sermons on the Small Catechism. It's not a bigger catechism, really. It's 10 sermons on the catechism. Now, the Small Called Articles, written by Luther himself, were written to distinguish Lutheranism from the Roman Catholic faith. And then lastly, the Formula of Concord. It's not so much a confession of faith as a positive thing, but it's purely a repudiation of errors within the Lutheran Church, and it's a compromise between the two parties every time.
mm,
So the way that a lot of churches handle these things, it depends on their synod. That's what I would say. It depends firstly on what region they came from. I was listening to your episode with Alex, and you mentioned the Lutheran churches and the Dutch churches. And with the Dutch churches, their denominations come in waves, immigration waves. With the Lutherans you mentioned, it depends on what region of America they're from. That's true, but it's also true in Europe, right?
mm,
So what confessions you confess, that depends firstly on what region of Europe your church came from, and then what synod you're in America,
right.
right? And there
Mm,
are also exceptions to this rule. For example, I can think of one Scandinavian church at least that did not confess anything other than the Augsburg Confession and the Small Catechism, but then they came in fellowship with a German church, and of course the Germans said, if you want to be friends, you have to confess all of these.
uh,
And so that's how that went down, right? And so there are different ways also of confessing the Book of Concord and its individual documents. This is a debate between conservatives and centrists and left-wing synods in confessing the Book of Concord, or just confessing the Augsburg Confession as something either fixed in time. Right. I don't want to oversimplify this and say it's either confessing it because it's biblical, or insofar as that's more of a reform discussion. But
right.
with the Lutherans, it's more of a Hegel or no Hegel discussion, right?
Mm,
So we're looking at, is this something fixed in time that we ought to repristinate and just bring back and bring back and bring back, or are we to recognize that this was part of a conversation? It's very situational, it's very circumstantial, and the discussion has moved dynamically forward. And so we are to see this as a part of the discussion in an ongoing conversation.
mm.
So there are those two kind of different ways, and you put that on a spectrum if you like. And so it's complex. It's complex, but those are the confessions. That's what we're working with.
Yeah, and that is very helpful, and I'm glad that you outlined a few of the places where I know online generally people will speak of confessional Protestant traditions, and they'll lump together maybe a certain group of Baptists and, of course, the Presbyterians, the Dutch Reformed, and Lutherans. But I'm glad you mentioned when we say confessional, people can mean different things with a different shade. And even within certain traditions, there are conversations about how far do we take this, or what exactly do we do with this? We have these documents we all respect, but where do they fit in? So it sounds like I'm glad you mentioned that as well with Lutherans. It does go beyond Germany. And of course, as you mentioned, Germany wasn't Germany back then. And I mentioned my family's from Germany. They're from a Roman Catholic part of Germany, the Rhineland, where nothing to do at all with Lutheranism and certainly Protestantism at large. There is quite a bitter history there at some points, not quite to the level of Ireland or something like that, but there is a history there. So that's helpful. And to hear, hey, there was a Saxon sort of church going on, or a synod, and they had discussions with what was going on in the Baltic or in the Scandinavian countries. And I think that really plays into where we're going to dip into perhaps the modern scene, especially in North America. And feel free to talk about Europe. But I think that that's critical for people to remember. I see it online sometimes. People talk about the German school, or I think the Finnish school gets a lot of discussion. Yep. So there's different, every denomination or tradition has different ways of framing perhaps their parties or streams of thought. It sounds like for Lutherans, it's perhaps which synod and which region you came from or trace back to. So there's a lot there, and we could go on for a lot. And there's a lot of history. I think I'm going to have you back on to talk about some of that history in between Luther and those early days, and perhaps the contemporary scene, which we're going to get to now. I know with my more English evangelical roots, there was a lot of connection with what was going on in Lutheranism after the period of Orthodoxy, where you have a lot of discussion. I think one of the works is True Christianity, that was quite popular in certain wings of Lutheranism, and there's some overlap there. A lot of controversy. We won't get into it now, but I'll have you back on, Connor. But now maybe let's talk about Lutheranism today. There's a lot of synods. I know people here in our region of Canada, it seems like, at least in my part of the suburbs outside of the GTA, Lutheranism isn't super big. But when you get to some parts of Ontario, you'll find a lot of Lutheran churches and a lot of a discussion, I suppose. If people are aware, there's the Evangelical Lutherans, there's the Lutheran Church Canada, there's other synods, smaller synods, American connections. So it's a big, confusing picture if you're outside of those circles. So I'm going to give you the hard question of, can you simply explain what is the denominational synodical landscape of Lutheranism? How does it all fit together? I don't know if that's too big for a question like this, but however you can answer, just help us out here.
Sure. So in short, we want to break it up 4 or 5 ways. We're not going to say, as maybe a Baptist could, you've got the conservatives, the liberals, and the centrists. Although we could do that, that's not as helpful with the Lutheran landscape. And the reason why is because these synods were formed around theological interest and conviction and direction. So especially in the way that they understood those confessions and the direction and purpose that they thought theology was going to have. So the first group we can talk about is, of course, the main line, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America and the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada. Now, this is the main line, so we can say, yes, this is liberal. There are conservatives there. My seminary, all of my professors are in the ELCA, but they're not liberals, right? So it's not to say you're in the ELCA or ELCIC, you're instantaneously a Schleiermachian or even neo-Orthodox, right? It's not to say that at all. But they are often categorized that way. You will see pride flags on their buildings. Often they are most of the time open and affirming, but they do have conscience clause and what they call the local option. You will find in the ELCA that their Lutheranism is more influenced by a broader mainline theology with a lot of Lutheran influenced Reformed. So we could look at Karl Barth, we could look at Jürgen Moltmann, we could look at individuals such as that and say, yes, they have had a very profound influence. And also the I forget, I can't speak French, but that certain group of Roman Catholics. So we're looking at Hans, how do you say his name? Hans Urs von Balthasar, however it goes, and Karl Rahner and Richard Rohr and dudes like that. So they have had a very large impact upon the ELC in both Canadian and American counterparts. There are some solid theologians there as well. Breaking out of the ELC, though, you have the churches that are essentially the ELC continuing, if you wanted to put it that way, which would tickle the ears of some Anglican listeners, perhaps.
Right.
Perhaps a certain Chinese Anglican listener.
Yes.
And those are where I would fall, right? So we wanted to say, yes, we want to continue that original dream that the original thing that we were doing, with bringing what was the Lutheran Church in America and the American Lutheran Church. One was Scandinavian, one was German. They brought them together. That became the ELCA and the ELCIC. Out of that, over different issues, for some of them, it was homosexual marriage. For others of them, it was Episcopalianism, because now the ELCA has Episcopal polity.
Right.
And so you saw churches leaving over different issues. And these churches are the Canadian Association of Lutheran Congregations, the Lutheran Congregations in Mission for Christ. I'm in both of those.
Yeah.
And then you also have the Episcopal one, which is the North American Lutheran Church, which many people will have heard of that. It's smaller than the LCMC. And then you have the Augsburg Lutheran churches. They're not Episcopal. Only one is Episcopal there. And so, of course, they left over different reasons. But for the most part, they all work together. We all have one single magazine. We all have one single publishing house. We swap our pastors a lot back and forth. Another big group that needs to be spoken about is what's called the Conservative Orthodox, or the Synodical Conference churches. Now, the Synodical Conference doesn't exist anymore. It's a historical term, but it is helpful to say all of these churches came from that one communion, and that is the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. That is the Lutheran Church of Canada, which is the Missouri Synod in Canada, for lack of a better term. You also have the American Association of Lutheran Congregations, and they actually, interestingly, came from that American Lutheran Church that later formed the ELCA, but they left before that. And they're in full fellowship with the Missouri Church. Now, on the other side, because we have two sides of this community, that's the Missouri side. On the other side, the more conservative side, we have two synods. They're in full fellowship with one another. This is the Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod and the Evangelical Lutheran Synod. One is German, one is Scandinavian. And it's the same with a lot of the Missouri congregations. Some of them are it's not like they have one kind of Scandinavian Missouri thing, but a lot of them did come from Scandinavian churches, and then they joined in later. Now, another group, which is the last big group, this is the fourth big group, is the Pietists. And so they're much more familiar to what an American evangelical context would be familiar with.
Right.
These are the American Free Lutheran Churches, the Church of the Lutheran Brethren, and the Laestadian Lutheran Church. And so these are guys, you'll walk in and they'll be wearing a suit and tie often. They'll very low church, very very big emphasis on a progressive sanctification that is definitely influenced by a lot of American evangelicalism. And for lack of a better term, you wouldn't really know the difference between them and, for example, a Reformed church, other than the communion, perhaps.
Right.
And then the last group is all of the many micro-synods. We could think here of one that's very popular now. It's the Evangelical Lutheran Diocese of North America.
Right.
But there are others, and they're simply too small to list them all. But we should just say, and all of them.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So that's very helpful. And I think a lot of people listening, they might have picked up on a few things, but I think the key takeaway there is there's a lot going on. There are different streams, but what we need to recognize is as you dig into it, certain categories that we like to broadly apply to every Christian denomination or tradition won't exactly fit in Lutheranism, where there's a particular history and geography going on there, and of course theology. And I think that also highlights maybe those terms, while they work for maybe a quick conversation, where are you coming from, I think for every group that we're going to find those broad labels don't exactly fit. I like that you mentioned with I believe the ELCA, that people typically think, that those are the progressive, super liberal Lutherans. But of course, as you mentioned, you can find conservative theologians in there, or however, even conservative might not work, but theologically orthodox people might be familiar that, hey, these are people that I might want to read, even though I don't consider myself, I would never be in that denomination or in that tradition, kind of thing like that. So there's a lot of nuance that needs to be addressed if we want to dig in deep, and if you want to get into a more scholarly kind of who's where and who should I be reading, and that those kind of conversations. So that helps. And I think people, if you're listening to this and if you know a Lutheran, just be aware that not all Lutherans are the same. There are those distinctions there where we know from online that if you meet someone in the Evangelical Lutheran Diocese of North America, I think, whatever that one is, they could be very, very different from perhaps every other kind of Lutheran you might meet.
They're very unique.
They're very unique. I know a couple of them from the internet, and it's sometimes fascinating, sometimes like, I can't believe this is a real person, but they could be very finicky about certain things, which I appreciate. People have their convictions, but not all Lutherans are the same. And I think that's worth appreciating. Not all, sometimes I meet Baptists online. I'm sure people meet me online and they think, is this guy real? Is this guy kidding? But different people with different backgrounds. So that's fascinating. And the other thing I really appreciated there is just recognizing again that diversity. And Connor and I have been talking a bit during my last school year. I was reading a lot of Lutheran theologians in my class on the sacraments, where I think most of the people I was reading were names you were familiar with in your circles. I apologize, I can't remember the names now, but a few of the people there, and I have to say I really appreciated it, where if I were to look at their denomination based on my presuppositions about, they're in the ELCA, those are the kind of Lutherans I want nothing to do with. But then I read some of these guys and I thought, wow, these are some very astute thought. Was it Yago? Was that one of them?
Yago, Yago.
Okay.
So Yago, you mentioned Jensen, you mentioned Broughton,
Jensen,
you mentioned Paul Hinlicky.
Yeah.
And all of these guys are in that that centrist borderline camp that came out of the ELCA.
Okay.
That's in that. So they're my folks.
Right.
But it is really important that you mention that. And if someone listens back to this, I'm sure they'll notice from when I was talking about the confessions through the synods, they'll pick up on the fact that Lutheranism, even if they go back to the history portion, it's not this kind of super institutional thing. It's a preaching movement. Right. And so when you meet a Lutheran on the street, they might not even agree with the next Lutheran you meet on the street about the confessions or the synods or ethics. What they do agree upon is the need for pastoral care and comfort of the soul. Right. That is the Lutheran heart. That's what makes you a Lutheran. It's reception.
Yeah. So that I think is powerful. I think that really, for a lot of people anyway, that might change the perception of what Lutheranism is and what it's about. And again, easy to get caught up, it's all about Luther, or it's all about having hard doctrinal distinctions, or being firm on some things. But I think it's a pastoral heart. And that's something I've appreciated, even reading those works in the sacraments class, where I was expecting from a Lutheran, they're going to have some 50-page document on the real presence and things like that. But instead it was like, how do we get the lay people to understand what this is and appreciate, again, the comfort and the assurance? Those are all big features. So maybe that's the segue now. We heard about the history, the denominational landscape today. Maybe, Connor, if you could just help us out here. A lot of people might hear this and still think, well, what did Lutherans, I understand they're pastoral and they have this great history, but what do they actually believe? So imagine, this is what I told Connor before, and I've been telling people on this this interview series. Imagine you were at my Baptist church, someone comes up to you and says, what's a Lutheran? What do they believe? So you have your confessions, of course, but if you were to highlight 2 or 3, I guess, doctrinal streams or positions that really define the movement in contrast to other Protestant groups or even Roman Catholics, I think that might be the big one where people struggle to see the difference. What would you say Lutheran is about theologically?
Yeah, theologically, what we want to say is we're of course, this is where the comfort all comes from. So theology is a reception of gift. It's a reception of and forgive me, this is not going to be 2 or 3, but it'll be quick. No worries. So to wrap it all up just at the beginning, so I can show you where we're going. We're going to the objectivity and universality of grace, so that every time it's administered to you, it's not a question of if it's there. It's not a question of, is this going to be efficacious? It's efficacious for everybody, and it's efficacious every time. And we don't worry about how that works, because of course someone will say, but people go to hell. Yeah, we don't know why. We don't know how. What we know is that what's promised is objectivity and universality, and that's going to be given to you every single Sunday, every time you come before the pulpit, every time you come to receive the body and blood of Christ, every time you remember your baptism. And that grace is like that cup that's overflowing, it's ever flowing. And so this is how we're doing it. We're going to start at the theology of the cross. This is what we call it, the theology of the cross, over and against the theology of glory. Now, when I was a Calvinist, I thought theology of glory, this is when I first met a Lutheran pastor. That sounds good. That sounds great. How could you deny that? You hate the glory of God? Or you must be some kind of degenerate or something.
Right.
But now I understand it. And what helped me to understand it from when I was first interested in Lutheranism in 2017 and met my first Lutheran pastor and attended my first Lutheran service was that moving forward, as I started to do more ministry as a student, working in field work in churches and doing internships, I realized, oh man, there's a lot of suffering here. There's a lot of misunderstanding here. There's a lot of doubt here. And so the theology of the cross brings us to that point. And it says, for example, in the Heidelberg Disputation, the gospel, so the law says do this and it's never done, right? But the gospel says believe that it is already done for you, right? So this is the theology of suffering, the theology of God on the cross, right, for you. So this is not some kind of high above God that you can't see, but it's the God who has become a human being like you, to suffer for you, to die for you, and to rise for you. And this is where we're starting. That's our starting point, the suffering of God for you, the incarnation of God, and an incarnational gospel. And then we want to move on to the distinction, the proper distinction, not separation, of law and of gospel. Earlier, I said the law says do this and it's never done. That is command, that's promise, and that's threat, and that's offer of reward for thee, do this, and it's never done. That its purpose is to kill. Its purpose, Paul says, is to increase sin. And the gospel, on the other hand, it hands to you freely everything. Right? So there is no reward in the gospel that you have to do anything for. It's not an opportunity. It's not hypothetical. It's a finished and free gift. This is where we're moving theologically. We are not mixing the two. So we're not saying the gospel is true if you do X. Nor are we saying you're saved or you're justified by faith alone and saved by faith and works. We're not saying that either. And we even had a controversy over that in the Formula of Concord called the Majorism controversy. You can go look that up. And then we're going to move on to what's called the solas or the soli. But instead of having 5, like you do, my dear friend Christian,
Yes.
we have 3. And we don't even have all 3 that you have. We changed one of them from sola scriptura. This is a common mistake, right? From sola scriptura to sola verba. And we do that for several reasons. Perhaps you can think of all of them right off the bat. But the word for one is Christ. Christ is received in the preaching and the reading of the scriptures, yes, but also in the sacraments. Okay, so we want to emphasize this. And then we're going to go to solus Christus. It's him alone. He's the word. He's the verba. So in a sense, we don't really even need sola verba because it's solus Christus. And then we move to sola fide. And faith alone. Now, we're not saying we don't like the other ones. We're just saying we never historically accepted them. Then we're moving to the means of grace. How does the word, who is Christ, come to us? He comes to us through word and through sacrament. And he does that efficaciously. He does what it says it does, right? So it's a funny word, is a speech act. A speech act, this doesn't mean some kind of liberal doctrine that was invented by a French philosopher or something. What this does mean is kind of like when a boss says you're fired, he's firing you by saying you're fired. Or in a marriage, Luther used this analogy too. I didn't sign a paper to become a husband, but when my wife said she takes me to be her husband, I then became her husband through that speech act. And just so as when the word of God spoke and light was, he said, let there be light, and there was. So he says to me, I declare you just, and I am. And this is how the word works. This is how the sacraments work. Lord's Supper, baptism. If you want to add confession to that, you can, but it's insofar as that's an extension of our baptism. And then we want to move on to the effect of the human person. We call this universal objective justification. So the word, who is Christ, he effects our salvation, not by telling us about it, but by doing it. And he does this on the cross. So when you say to a Lutheran, when were you saved? They're not going to say, well, I had a conversion experience in 2006. They're not even really going to go back to the cross, though they could. And this is a universal objective justification, but even more so, they're going to go back to the predestination of God and to say, God chose me in Christ. And I know this because Christ was on the cross and he did it, and he accomplished that salvation for me. And right there, as that blood hit the sand under the cross of Golgotha, that my sins were washed away. Just as the blood of the atonement lambs and the sheep and the goats and the ox and the bulls were sprinkled upon the altar, so now this is sprinkled upon me, and I'm cleansed of sin. And so we're coming back now to the universality and the objectivity of grace. So theology of the cross, distinction between law and gospel, the means of grace, the solas, and the objectivity of justification. And that brings us then to the church. What is the church? Well, with you Baptists, we agree it's not the unbelievers. And it's also not synonymous with the institution. Right, so the church are those believers, and it has an institution, it has word and sacrament, and we're not saying the institution is like the organization and the membership slip that you sign or whatever. It's not the members' roll. As we know, as people who work in churches, most people on the members' roll don't actually show up at most churches. So right, it's the believers who are there who are receiving those things instituted by Christ. That is the church, both here and in heaven. And then so that brings us to what we are. We are evangelical Catholics. We are traditional Protestants. Some call us the conservative Reformation, but at root, we are gospel folks. That's about it.
That is amazing, Connor. That is fantastic. I have to say that really summarizes it so well. And I think people listening, again, you might miss some of that. There was a lot there. And the beauty of a recording is that please feel free to listen to that again. If you missed something, just click back the time a couple minutes, you'll hear it all again. But already there, I think we're hearing so much of what makes Lutheranism such just a fantastic Protestant tradition, where a lot of people, I know the law and gospel distinction, a lot of non-Lutherans will say, hey, there's a lot of great there we need to think about. And of course, all the things building into comfort. And I think, and I'll say it now, I'm not sure if I'll cut this out, but I probably won't. I'm not writing down notes, but an idea came to my head, have a panel in the future on the solas and how we put those together, how we word those. That is a fantastic conversation. I'm glad you brought that up, and that change there. It really does add a nuance that I think brings out Lutherans, I guess, emphases on this word and sacrament, which that might be another fantastic panel. I'm thinking about it. How do we make sense of word and sacrament in church? So fantastic. That's great. And maybe you'll have to bear with me. I thought of something right at the start where you said, considering Lutheranism in 2017, and here we are now, 2021, with you explaining Lutheranism on my podcast. There has to be some sort of connection there with 1517 and 1521. I'm not super into any sort of magical numbers or anything like that, but rather auspicious, I would say. But that
is auspicious. Yeah, this is the diet of Zoom.
Yeah, the diet of Zoom. There you go. That's going to have to make it into the episode description. But Connor, thank you for explaining that. People, again, if you're interested, I'm sure I'll talk to Connor later. He already mentioned his different shows with information and systematics and Bible studies, that sort of stuff. So if you're interested in hearing more about the theology and different things like that, I'm sure we'll have helpful links down below for people to dig in. But I guess to bring this to a place of conclusion now, I know we've talked about, I suppose, more abstract things, the history, the denominations, the theology. Let's close on the practical with, what's a Lutheran church service like? What is going on in actual Lutheran church circles and things like that? Yeah. So maybe you could just walk us through. I have two questions here. First of all, what's happening on a Sunday morning or whenever you meet for a church? I don't know if you have an evening service as well, but what's happening in a church service? So if I were to visit, what would I see? And then later on, I'll ask you what else in addition to a church service is going on in a Lutheran church family. So let's start with the service. What's going on there? What do you call it, a service, or is there another name that you use in Lutheranism? Maybe start there.
Sure. Just before I begin, this is where all of what we've been speaking about comes to the concrete. Yeah. So this is where the boots of grace come onto the ground, and they come and meet you, and they hand you the flesh of Christ. So this, we call it the divine service, the Gottesdienst. This is really important to us because what it says from the get-go This is not about you serving God. This is not about you coming to whisper into his ear some sweet nothings about how great he is. This is him coming to the deathbed of the hospital and reviving dead, broken sinners and sending them out on their way, only knowing that they're going to come back next week again. Okay,
Right.
from the forefront, every single thing in the Lutheran liturgy, it is about God being for you, serving you. What that looks like, we confess, doesn't matter. Or I should say adiaphora, so that the conservative guys don't get mad at me for saying doesn't matter. But and so what we mean by adiaphora is indifferent. Whether you think indifferent means doesn't matter or means matters very much, I forgive you for disagreeing with me, whatever. But so it can generally look like a mix between a Roman Catholic church or a high church Anglican congregation, maybe a little bit lower than that. But it can also look like Christian's church on a Sunday. It can look very evangelical. So you can come into a church, you can have low church, you can have high church, to use the Anglican terms.
Right.
You can have contemporary worship, you can have hymns, you can have exclusive psalmody. I know a congregation that does that.
Wow.
You can have a rock band, you can have a cappella, you can have an organ, you can have a piano, you can have a worship team. Some pastors will wear an alb and stole, that's the white robe and the clothy thing, the dishcloth, the glorified dishcloth. And then some wear suit and tie, some wear suit and collar, some wear what's called a thaler robe, that's the black robe. Some know this as the Genevan gown or the academic robe, preaching robe, you might see it advertised as. Some wear a cassock and a surplice, kind of more like the Anglicans or the Scandinavians do. And this also has to do with regional stuff. Because it is adiaphora in Germany, they are much lower church. They generally wear the black robes, which you would call a Genevan gown. I'm probably guessing correctly about that,
Yeah.
if you saw one. And then in Scandinavia, much different. Just to put it that way, much different. Very Roman Catholic, very, very high church in Scandinavia. And those things are reflected in America. So if you wanted to look for a high church congregation, you're generally looking at the ELCA or the ELCIC or the LCMS, right? WELS tend to be lower church. My churches tend to be lower church. That's the borderline, guys. The NALC tends to be a little bit higher church, just to, again, use those Anglican terms again. But even in the LCMS, even in the ELCA, you will find churches that have contemporary worship, rock bands, smoke machines and everything, right? And the funny thing is, in the center of the church is an altar. So, you might have Hillsong sung, but then when it comes time, you will be ushered to the front to do the altar call. So believe it or not, we're secretly Baptists. And
There you
you're
go.
going to come there and to confess the faith again by receiving Christ in your hand or in your mouth, whatever, generally in the hand though, especially if you've just been singing Hillsong.
Yeah, I'd imagine so.
Yeah, and so it can look like a lot of things, but the things you will always get and you should always expect from a Lutheran church, whether low church or high church, at the very least, is the confession and absolution, the word read and preached, prayer, the benediction, and the sacraments. Those things are, and this is very similar to what the Calvinists would call the regulative principle of worship. We have the elements of worship, and then we have the circumstances of worship. The only difference is that, sorry, somebody's calling me. The only difference is that we label them and list them differently. Outside of that, in our own personal lives, just like the Reformed have family worship, we have a personal kind of what we call the monkhood of all believers, kind of like the priesthood of all believers, but it's better because it's every day. And so this is what's called the liturgy of the hours. The Anglicans, I believe, call them the daily offices. At the very least, every single one of our service books has what's called matins, morning prayer, vespers, evening prayer, and compline, nighttime prayer. But we do have breviaries which go through all of the hours of the day, which are more than 3, frankly. And so, to speak of our preaching, because that's also something that people probably have in mind, or they say, well, Lutheran sermons, they're probably so small. That again depends on the region and the synod. So you have, I won't mention them. So one of them tends to preach under 10 minutes. Another one of them tends to preach between 10 and 20. Another one tends to preach between 20 and 30. Another 30 to 45, and another 45 to an hour.
Wow.
If you go and just Google that up a bit, listen to different sermons from different synods, you'll figure out very quickly which ones are which. So, and in the same way as the length of the sermon is also audiophora, as we say, indifferent.
Right.
Some would say doesn't matter, to put it in common parlance. The administration of the sacrament of the supper can be once a week. It can be twice a month. It can be once a month, once every 2 months. It can be quarterly, right? So those things you don't know. What you do know is you're going to be served grace. That's all you know. And if you live in a region where there's a lot of evangelicals, expect the church will probably look like a lot of evangelical things and influences. If it's in a very Catholic area, will likely be higher church. If it's in a very Reformed area, that's where the EP congregation is.
Right.
So yeah, we're basically, because it's audiophora, it's taking on the familiarity of the people around them.
Right. So, and that is, again, fascinating, the diversity there. And sorry, you mentioned someone's calling you. Do you need to take a call or go somewhere?
No.
Oh, okay. Okay. Fantastic. So yeah, that I think really explains a lot. And again, I apologize. A lot of my experience with Lutheranism does come from online. So you find a certain kind of theologically driven person online who will present things very differently. So as you're saying it here, and you're actually boots on the ground in the church, living amongst the people at a Lutheran school, interacting. So there's a lot of diversity, and it is treated in such a way where there is almost an expectation of, depending on the culture around you, there is a bit of I guess, to use Tim Keller's word, there's a contextualization going on there where if you're in a Catholic area, it looks more Catholic, or Reformed, a bit more Reformed. And that explains a lot. So I remember reading a paper about the Black Genevan piety of, I think, the Wisconsin Lutherans, where they took that on, and it was very much high church. No, thank you. We're doing it. It felt like they were doing it like the Reformed. And I know I see it more so online. It almost familiar with the worship wars, where some people in the LCMS are concerned about the contemporary worship. We need to bring back the higher church, and that might be different parts of the geography in more Catholic areas, maybe resenting what's going on in more urban areas. I'm not sure, but I do see that diversity. And I think you explained why that is so well. It's a recognition. We have certain core things that we need to do, but then how that gets played out, there is a recognition. It can look different. It can smell different or sound different. So that I think is familiar, especially to a lot of Baptists, where there's a joke online about Baptists in Georgia and Baptists in Georgia, where in the country of Georgia, they look very Eastern Orthodox. I think that would surprise people. And of course, there are some theological questions there. And then people can imagine what Baptists in the Deep South in Georgia look like, where both Baptists, but very different looks. And it sounds like that's Lutheranism, but a lot more prevalent, where different regional distinctions come out, but you're still going to get that sermon, that benediction, and of course, the Lord's Supper or communion, whatever. Sorry, I can't remember what term you use to describe
both of those are great.
Okay, fantastic. So and you'll still get that with the theology thereof. And I loved how you explained that. People, I hope you heard that with the divine service. It's what God's doing. And I think that ties in again with the pastoral comfort side and the objectivity and universality you mentioned with the Lutheran theology. And maybe it's on that point, I'm sorry to do this, but just in case anyone listens to this interview and this interview alone, I want to make it clear, I am a Baptist, Connor is a Lutheran. We have disagreements, but this episode, we're just hearing from Connor, and then that's what it is. If you want to find a debate between a Lutheran and a Baptist, you can find that so many places online, so many different Facebook groups, Discord servers. We're just hearing, we're learning today. So Connor, thank you so much for explaining that. And you mentioned the monkhood of all believers. That is fascinating to me, with that distinction there. And that might be something people didn't realize about Lutherans. And maybe that's, again, depending what Lutherans are around you, you'll get very different kinds of Lutherans, where I imagine the praying the hours might not be so common in more evangelical kind of pietist circles, and maybe it is another one. So that's fascinating to me. And I guess the final question I'll end off on now, Baptists will typically call, I hear the joke, Wednesday is our second Lord's Day, our second Sabbath, with our prayer meeting or our second service, kind of thing like that. And we have Bible studies throughout the week and those kind of issues, small groups, and we'll call those small groups life groups or things like that. So maybe what else is going on? I imagine Lutherans do confirmation classes, given your understanding of the church. So what other kind of things are churches doing when it comes to fellowship and believers getting together?
Yeah, so of course throughout the week, again, this depends because it's audiophoria, so it's
Right.
going to, we're all about worshiping in the vernacular, so
Mm,
to speak, and living in the vernacular. And so this is going to look like who's around you and what influences your congregation has. You might have an evangelical extemporaneous prayer meeting.
mm,
You might have a prayer service of one of those, matins, vespers, compline at a
right.
congregation weekly. You might have that, especially in Catholic areas. Um, you often have a Bible study, whether that's on a midweek day or on a Sunday or both. That again depends on your congregation. And of course, confirmation classes.
Mm,
Yes, absolutely. But the important thing is to remember, of course, because these are audiophora, and we live in North America where everything is whatever goes, essentially. And there's so much diversity that you can have something look one way on one half of the town and it will look so different on the other.
right.
You have Georgia and you have Georgia,
Yeah.
as you said. And so I know some congregations where their confirmation class is no children at all. It's really in all ages, but all the children are gone. And so they just do confirmation, not to confirm anybody, but they do catechesis study every single week. I
Mm,
know other congregations who would they would be revolted at the idea of an extemporaneous prayer meeting, and they would only have the prayer service, right? Because they'd say, prayer meeting, what do you mean I'm going to come and give God all these things? What is God doing for me? So you have these different perspectives. You have these different ways of understanding things, ways of living and worshiping and living in the vernacular.
mm. So, and that I think really helps clear up what, again, a lot of people's ideas about Lutheranism. If you're from a certain area and you're thinking, oh, Lutherans are very Catholic, that might be because in that area they look very Catholic and they wouldn't like the evangelical prayer service. Or maybe if you're thinking, oh, Lutherans are just German evangelicals, you might be from a part of town where that's the kind of church situation. So that, Connor, I have to say that's my big takeaway today, where you really explained the diversity that I think we see in Lutheranism, where no one I guess stereotype of Lutheranism will fit. And I know I believe a Swedish Lutheran online, they posted a picture of their church. I thought, this is the highest church I've ever seen in my life. And then of course, as I mentioned, I read that paper, and I know some Lutheran sort of chapels in this area here where, yeah, I go in there and I'm expecting probably something that looks very Puritan, I would imagine. So
Yeah.
that diversity is amazing. And I think it again speaks to the theology and where you're going to put here is what we're about. And it's not necessarily the form, it's this concept of grace and how a person receives it objectively. So again, that is fantastic. There's a lot more I'm sure we could say now. We're going to have you back on in the future, get into some of those historical points and different ideas of terminology and theology. So maybe for now, as we close, this is something I do with all my guests. I want to give you an opportunity to share one reflection or encouragement or something along those lines for my audience. It doesn't have to be specifically Lutheran. It could be a book recommendation, but anything you have on your mind just to leave us with as we move on from this interview.
Yeah, well, the most Lutheran thing that I can leave with all of you is just to pronounce that the forgiveness of all of your sins has been accomplished in Christ Jesus,
Hmm.
and that you now have peace through the flesh of Christ, to go out in your weeks and serve your neighbor, for them, not for yourself and not for God, and to live in the light of Christ and his cross and the peace that he's given you.
Praise God. That is a fantastic encouragement to leave people with. And I'm sorry to say, as you said that, I realized another big thing that people in my circles know Lutherans for is the doctrine of vocation, which I think a lot of people get from there are certain Lutheran figures which talk about how we relate to the world and our work. And as you said, that serving your neighbor, that came to mind. But let's save that for another time. Let's leave it
Yeah.
on what you just said there. That's fantastic. So Connor, thank you for coming on. I think everyone learned a lot. They have I'm sure a lot of information, a lot of questions. So as I always say, please, if you have any questions about Lutheranism, about anything Connor said, if something Connor didn't mention and you want to hear a bit more about, leave a comment down below. Connor and I will be talking. And if you have a question, I'll make sure that he gets it and he can respond. We want to keep the conversation going, but that's it for now. Thanks again, Connor. And to everyone listening, thank you for listening again. Leave those questions. Let's keep it going. And I'll see you next time here on Christians Colloquy. Take care.